All right, so to give us some perspectives on the budget, we've got Mr. Ben Akabueze, who is the DG Budget Office. He joins us this morning. Good morning, and thank you for joining us today on the program. Well, looking through the dailies, quite a number of them are not that optimistic about the budget. They highlight the, well, as the president spoke about, looming recession. They talk about the debt service ratio. And is there any reason why they should be optimistic on this one?
Well, I mean, it seems to be people's stock in trade to be pessimistic, but that doesn't help the discussion. This is a budget for the federal government and for all of us. So we will respond to specific observations, and if there are questions around any of the specific assumptions underlying the budgets, we will respond to that. But we can't respond to people's feelings of pessimism or optimism. All I can say is that we have, painstakingly, come up with this, and we have done so believing this, budget to be, realizable. So, but I can't speak to any specific assumptions, as I said.
Well, for instance, now the budgets. Okay, let's take a look at the allocations to the National Assembly and that of education. We've always consistently looked at the education sector to see how we could pay a lot more premium to that sector. So clearly, they want to understand the rationale behind the 128 billion naira allocation to National Assembly and then 127 billion naira allocation to the education sector.
First of all, the allocation to the education sector is not 127 billion naira. 127 billion naira is the capital.
Statutory transfer.
No, capital, no. 127 billion naira is the capital expenditure for the education, Ministry of Education and its agencies. Apart from that, you have for Ministry of Education, you have 545 billion naira allocated, for their recurrent expenditure, mainly their salaries and their overheads. So you have 127, you have 545. For Ministry of Education also, you have for UBEC, Universal Basic Education, you have 70 billion naira. In addition, you have over 200 billion naira for Tech Fund. Okay. When you aggregate all of this, in this budget, we have close to 1 trillion naira allocated to education. And I don't know the fixation, maybe people don't read the budget right. You simply pick the capital budget. The allocation to the National Assembly is not like for capital. That's the totality of their, their budget for their recurrent expenditure, their capital expenditure, and everything else, or whatever they do. So, and the other thing you will note is that allocation was 128 billion naira in 2020. It remains 128 billion naira in 2021. The budget for Ministry of Education, on the other hand, the capital budget, which is now 127 billion in 2021, is about 3 times what it was. No, it's twice what it was. It was 75 billion. It was nearly twice what it was. It was 75 billion this year. So I think we should basically be, factual in evaluating the budget, and so
right.
That's my explanation to those who don't understand, as you said, the allocations.
Okay. Well, the president himself said that the major challenge is revenue generation. And I mean, if the president says that, you imagine people thinking, so how are we going to go around this budget? In fact, the president himself said that you can only borrow as much. You can't borrow your way into funding the whole of the budget. So looking at the president's statement on revenue generation and the fact that, I mean, for a lot of people who are already in a recession, so, I mean, there's only the need for the figures to come out for us to confirm that. So revenue generation, I mean, that's the bedrock of any budget implementation. So regarding that, people are pessimistic. Is there any way around it?
Well, the concern for revenue generation is already reflected in the projections. We've got 13 billion naira in total spending. We've got revenues, plus privatization proceeds of 8 billion and aggregate borrowings of 5 billion. That's how this thing. So all that the president is saying is 5 trillion. Sorry, I'm talking about 13 trillion, and it cuts out revenues of just a little over 8 trillion and borrowings of just a little under 5 trillion. All that you're saying is we would have liked, but for the challenges with revenue, we would have liked to borrow less than the nearly 5 trillion. That's what you're saying, but not that the budget has not taken, factored in. And then the point is, at this point, when you draw the budget, you set your limits for borrowing. You don't have to borrow if you don't need. So if revenues actually perform better than they have been projected based on our collective effort to drive same, then we will end up needing to borrow less than has been projected. That's what Mr. President is saying.
And perhaps a way to maybe ensure that our revenues perform better, than we project is also partly hinged on one of the statements the president made about government-owned enterprises, saying that their cost ratio, that's the cost to revenue ratio, should be scrutinized, and basically saying that, I mean, if you're not generating a lot, why are you spending a lot, or why are you taking a large chunk in the budget? So is there any way around that? First, is that reflected in this current appropriation bill? Are you looking at government-owned enterprises that are not generating a lot of revenue? Are you cutting their costs according to this particular projections that we have? That's on one hand.
Well, basically, the president wasn't talking about something he's proposing to do, but something he had done. He said he had basically, set ceilings on their cost to revenue ratios. So the effective this year, the president has set a cost to revenue ratio ceilings for the government-owned enterprises to between 60% and 70%, depending on their particular circumstances. But these are maxima. These ratios are maxima ratios. Those agencies are still expected to drive efficiencies below these ratios. What has happened for now is that practically everybody is hanging at the maximum, projecting their costs at the maximum. And what the president is saying is that, okay, despite having set those, cost to revenue ratios, he believes that there's still scope to rationalize the costs of those agencies, and that's why I was asking the National Assembly to also look into that as they consider the budgets, in addition to the effort that we have put in on our own side.
So I'm just thinking, how much is that saving the country? Because within the space of a few months this year, the president said, well, these agencies actually took about 34% of our whole revenue, and that's a huge chunk. And a lot of people point to that and say, well, how about we cut the cost of governance? So in that line, if we're going to cut our costs, what is the thinking really beyond just putting a cap on their cost to revenue ratio? What is the thinking regarding the overhead and all that?
Well, you recall that last year when we presented the revised medium-term expenditure framework 2021 to 23, as well as the revised 2020 budget, following the onset of COVID-19, there were a number of administrative measures that were proposed and also approved by the Federal Executive Council. And one of them was that government should revisit the recommendations of the Oronsai-led panel report on rationalizing government. And indeed, that's an ongoing process. I can also say that in this, for the 2021 budget, there are a number of, agencies of government that generate their own revenues but still used to draw on the federal government budget that have been kicked out of the budget, with effect from 2021. And if you aggregate savings from, basically kicking such organizations outside of the budget for, 2021, they aggregate to over 80 billion naira. So this is an ongoing process. It's not a magic wand that you can wave. And the other thing to note is that, again, partly because, as you have observed repeatedly, we are essentially, we are technically in a recession already. Government is also being mindful about keeping people in jobs, keeping people in employment at this time. The private sector is not creating a lot of jobs at this point, Ali, and government is worried about compounding the unemployment problem by also, resorting to renting. So oftentimes people throw out this phrase, cost of government, cut cost of government. While that is useful and remains under view, government has what is called the efficiency unit, which continues to look at costs and come up with ideas to cut costs in different areas.
Talking about cutting costs, just for a moment,
Mr. Akabuzi. Let me just make this point so we can understand. If we look at the structure of our budget, the single largest item in the budget is personnel cost. In this year's, in the 2020 budget, you see that that's 3.7 trillion naira. Okay, we have debt service of 3.1 trillion naira. When you add the 220 billion naira transferred to sinking funds, between those two, you already have more than 7 trillion naira. You are at 7.1 trillion between those two. You have statutory transfers of nearly half a trillion. So you are at 7.6 trillion naira already.
Yep. But if you don't mind, Mr. Akabuzi, if you don't mind, you talked about...
When you add the capital expenditure of 3.85 trillion naira, you are at, you are over 10 trillion naira of the expenditure.
We get all of that.
Talking about the cost of governance, yes.
But we get all of that, and I think that that really is something that is of concern to everyone. But the challenge that a number of people have also expressed concern over is the fact that year after year, the the Auditor General's office goes around all the MDAs, especially of the federal government, and they always discover a lot of loopholes. And they always mention certain names of people that are supposed to get one thing or the other done to return monies into the pockets of the federal government in the name of cutting costs. Is there anything that we need to do urgently, and who should, to ensure that these loopholes, if we can call them that, are blocked, and those people whom the Auditor General's office calls to question, they really do answer to someone, so that we can limit some of these loopholes and these gaps that we have had over the years?
Well, you can be sure that that's what always happens. That's a process that kicks in. That's why you see it in the report. The Auditor General's report goes to the Public Accounts Committee of the National Assembly, public account committees, and those committees summon those people. The actions that are recommended, unless the people prove that the Auditor General's report was inaccurate, are normally carried out. But the point is, aggregate those. I'm dealing here with materiality. While those are important, we're talking, for instance, this year the budget is 10.8 trillion naira. What is the aggregate of those items refund here. Oh, this person has here, refund here. When you aggregate them, so they aggregate to 10 billion naira. Fantastic. So you save the 10 billion naira. That doesn't move the needle. So while we continue to pursue those things, those are not, from where I sit and I look at aggregates, those are not the things that will move the needle for us.
The World Bank did recommend 22.5% debt service to revenue ratio. But as at May 2020, as this year, the NESG puts ours at 74%. They say, look, it even came down from 99%. What are we doing about that?
Well, it's a matter of concern, and that concern came through even in the president's speech, and that's why I'm saying, really, even though our aggregate debt stock ordinarily should not be a concern, but our debt service to revenue ratio is a concern, and it's a concern, okay, because the revenue is too low, not because the debt is too high, and therefore, if we address the real issue, which is our revenues, as the revenues then grow, the denominator grows, that ratio, declines. That's why, we're very upfront about this, that this is our number one, challenge that we've got to tackle as a country. But, tackling, revenue generation challenge is not easy, not especially during periods of difficulty. The economy went into recession in 2016 and 2017. As we emerged and embarked on a period of recovery, the expectation was that as recovery, you kick from recovery to growth, then you can get more aggressive on the revenue side of things. And then COVID-19 came, and bang, again we are in a recession. And when that happens, you basically more or less take your foot off the throttle a bit in driving revenues, because at that point you want to increase spending power in the hands of people, and so you apply a little bit of brake, and that's the reality of what we are dealing with. But I can tell you that the driving of revenues is the number one fiscal issue that number one issue that we on the fiscal side of government worry about daily.
Concerns to different groups and different bodies about this revenue generation and plugging those leakages. They look to the refineries. Now that the subsidy is gone, they're asking questions as to the refineries, for instance, haven't posted profits, some say between 10 to 15 years. And then the data they crunched indicated that there's a combined loss of 154 billion and 149.23 billion in 2018 and 2019. That's a huge chunk. And what is the thinking to address this almost immediately, as soon as possible?
Well, you see, the thing is, people want to eat their cake and have it. People obey and approbate at the same time. The same who are concerned about that are concerned also about deregulating the sector. Without deregulating the sector, you're not going to see the investment in those refineries. The same people who are concerned about this, in the twilight of Obasanjo's administration, he sold the Port Harcourt refineries for about $700 million. The people went up in arms. Oh, they dashed our refineries to their friends. They've sold it for cheap. It's this, blah, blah, blah. President Yar'Adua, unfortunately, reversed that transaction. Today, those 4 refineries, you won't see anybody. I don't think you will find anybody who will pay you, $500 million for all 4 together. But this is a reality. We operate in a democracy, so government listens, to people. But we can't have it both ways. So we've got to, if we want those refineries if we want investors in the refineries, they're not going to put their money in it when they cannot recover their money by selling the product that they produce. They've got to depend on a subsidy program that they can't count on. So that's part of why government is making a push on. The government is pushing on two fronts. If you listen to the GMD of NNPC, so with the regulation of petrol, which was the only one really, the only product which price was still, regulated, but which is the most consumed of the refined petroleum products in the country. With that now, it's made it easier for them to cut the deals on getting the refineries, fixed by private investors.
Mr. Kabuza, are you suggesting that there may be plans to privatize the refineries?
No, I didn't say to, because when you use the word privatize, privatize is a very broad term. There are different things, privatization options range from even what you call management contract.
Okay, so what is the plan to plug those leakages in that particular area?
Sorry?
What is the plan now to address this huge concern in that sector, since there's no more subsidy?
Well,
we'll have to...
I think perhaps, if you spoke to the GMD of NNPC, he will give you a more up-to-date, but all I've said is they are engaging with private sector investors, okay, to find the base, to get those. The other thing that they're doing is, and which was something the president was insistent about, these refineries were built by known companies, international companies with the expertise in building them. One of the reasons we got to where we are is that over time, successive administrations resorted to awarding turnaround maintenance contracts on those refineries to simply put it, incompetent, essence or companies. So the idea now is to re-engage the original, the OEM, manufacturers of those plants.
All right.
Manufacturers, to bring them back to be involved in rehabilitating those refineries, so you can do a thorough fix, not the patchwork that has happened over time.
All right, then, Mr. Ben Akabueze, DG Budget Office, thank you for your time this morning.
My pleasure.